Welcome. During this session, we will gain perspective on bushfires and climate from the University of Tasmania's Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science, as well as the Director of the Fire Center Research Hub School of Natural Sciences, David Bowman, who has done an extensive amount of work and research exploring the relationship between fire, landscapes, and humans. During this interview, he will explain the role of climate in bushfires and how we can better prepare for catastrophic bushfires going forward. So without further ado, we'll just jump straight into our first question. Hello, David. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing on bushfires?
So I've been studying landscape fires, bushfires, and the effect of those bushfires on landscapes and the origin of those fires for my whole working life, actually. And that's taken me from southwest Tasmania, where I originally trained, understanding the regeneration of logged eucalypt forests in the mountains of Tasmania, to the Northern Territory, where I worked on fire ecology for 20 years, working with Aboriginal people. Then across the continent, looking at various facets of fire, particularly the controls of fire and the environment on rainforest in Australia. And then that led me to want to globalise my research project. So I ended up developing a more global perspective, and that led me to the recognition that we don't really have a good title or handle for this intersection of fire, the environment, and society and culture. We don't really, we treat that problem in boxes, and we like to have specialists who think about these sub-questions, I suppose. And a lot of those sub-questions really weren't of much interest to anybody either. And holistic thinking was sort of quite an elusive thought until human beings have hit over the head with a rock the last 20 years by these increasingly dramatic fires, which aren't really such an environmental issue anymore. They're more of a social and a political and a cultural and a human health issue. So in my life, I suppose I've been very lucky of starting where it's logical to start, in the landscape with fire, and to follow the lead. And that lead took me to Aborigines. It took me back to the interface between bushland and where people live. And it took me to a global perspective. And it took me ultimately to a recognition of the fact that the Earth's climate is changing, and that's affecting fire activity and creating the sorts of fire seasons we've been experiencing over the last decade or so.
So that sort of leads right nicely into our second question. Let's talk about the latest catastrophic fire season that Tasmania first experienced, and then the rest of the country, and really the role of climate change in these bushfires. And then a second part to that is this bushfire intensity something that we can expect going forward?
You know, one of the questions that pops up after these fire disasters is why? Why the fire disaster, and what role does climate have? And that the way you think about that question may really reflect some underlying preconceptions that you may hold, or may be shaped by your experience. And what's interesting is that there's been reasonable doubt about what we would call attribution of, the cause of these fires, let alone the consequences of these fires, which is a hard thing to understand ecologically, particularly. But the causes, what causes them? And what's happened over the last 2 decades is that there were hints that climate change could be driving worsening fire weather. There were hints, and some people wanted to draw that conclusion quite quickly, but it was difficult because there are all these other countervailing factors like land use, like urban design, like human ignitions, and like background natural variability. So just jumping to a conclusion that the Black Saturday fire that burnt such a large part on the outskirts of Melbourne was the signature of climate change, 2009, it really wasn't possible for a scientist to confirm or deny that hypothesis. It would just have to say, well, that's a hypothesis. But what we're now seeing are two things. The first thing we're seeing is there's just a lot more global fire disasters around the world, all around the world, not just in California, in British Columbia, but we're talking Portugal, Spain, France, Chile, but also we're seeing in Australia, like a staircase, that it's, this fire, then this fire, the 03 fire that burnt into Canberra, then the 07 fire that burnt, 1 million hectares of the Australian Alps, and the 09 fire, then the Dunalley fire, the 2013 fire that burnt down a seaside village and people had to run for their lives and jump into the sea. And then the Tasmanian wilderness fires in 2016, and then the Tasmanian wilderness fires in 2019, which were historically the largest area burnt by a long way, because we're talking since the turn of the century in Tasmania, about 5% of the island has been burnt by bushfires, which is an astronomical amount for an environment that really had, certainly got a very deep fire ecology, but the return time of these fires should be a lot lower. So it's a constellation of factors that what we're seeing when, like a detective, it's not, we don't have a, maybe a simple analogy. It's not like we've got a video camera watching the murder, and it's like, who the murderer is, the murder weapon, the victim, everything about it. It's all time-stamped. It's a perfect, record of the murder. Well, with these fires, we don't have that. What we have, just like a detective trying to understand a murder, is that they have clues. They start seeing patterns and they build those clues together, and the constellation of those clues, they build an argument to say, I think I know who the murderer is. In fact, I'm certain who I know the murderer is. And that's the point we've come to with climate change and fire. It's not a simple looking up the big book of fire records, looking up the big book of climate records, putting them together and getting a perfectly straight line. It doesn't work like that. It's a lot more complicated. There's so many other countervailing factors. But when you look at all of the factors together, we're increasingly certain that climate change is driving this worsening fire weather. But worse, we're seeing areas reburnt. So we have now in the Australian Alps, areas that have now been reburnt at least 3 times. And that changes the way the forest can regenerate. It changes the amount of carbon storage in the system. And in fact, the scary possibility, and we're beginning to see, not just in Australia, but certainly in the boreal zone, where these and the tropics, major carbon banks that are taking carbon and storing it in a solid form in living material largely, those carbon banks are being vaporized. So when you add, burning down your biospheric carbon bank, you're still adding in the CO2 from the fossil carbon. You're really accelerating climate change. And there will be a point, we don't know when that will be, where we may actually start losing control of our forests, that they will just stop being reliable carbon stores. And that will then accelerate climate change. And of course, the terrifying thought is we could be tipped into a hothouse world where we actually, really significantly change the Earth system and change the capacity of the Earth system, the storage capacity, basically, of the Earth system, because we're changing, possibly, for all intents and purposes, forever, the background CO2 concentrations of the atmosphere.
Very scary stuff. Thank you for that explanation. So in the latest bushfire season, there was a lot of misinformation around hazard reduction, and specifically there were a lot of fingers pointed at local governments for not properly managing this. Can you tell us a little bit about hazard reduction burning, whose role it actually is, and is it the silver bullet that we're being led to believe?
So this comes back to these countervailing or confounding factors that affect how we think about fire. So as I said, it depends on your point of departure. You could look at these fires and say, systemic failure of fuel management. And it's not really downplaying climate change and upregulating the role of fuel management. And what would be the logic of that? The logic of that is that in a forested environment that's combustible, fuel builds up, and eventually in a combustible environment, you're going to get a coincidence of an ignition, appropriate weather, and that will set fire to your fuel, and that fuel will burn possibly very intensely. So the logic of hazard reduction burning is to say, well, we can't control the weather. Well, actually, we can, or we are, because we're affecting climate change, but just not in a precise way. We're just making it hotter and possibly drier and certainly more unpredictable, certainly different to background. But because we can't directly control the weather, and we're imperfect at controlling ignitions, because there are always going to be bad actors in society, there are always going to be accidents, and there's always going to be lightning, and we can't get to a fire start fast enough, reliably, to extinguish all of those ignitions. So there are going to be fires in the landscape. So a fire manager would say, well, what we're left with is managing the fuel. So their logic is that through fuel management, you can change the behaviour of the fire, because you can burn under conditions of your choice rather than nature's choice. And by changing the behaviour of the fire, it becomes more controllable. And that means that if there's a subsequent fire, it may encounter that burnt area and just not proceed. So that's creating a barrier. Or it may move onto that area, but the behaviour of it may change because there's less fuel, it's less intense. So that's the pro-prescribed burning argument. Sometimes it gets an added coupling to the pro-burning argument, is it's what the Aborigines did. And I could explain that's a sort of true statement, sort of true. But the cons to prescribed burning are that under extreme fire conditions, actually it doesn't work. That whatever's going to burn is going to burn anyway. And that's been shown several times, and there are analyses underway with the Black Summer fires that, it's not just simply a matter of fuel failure. Now, that's a really important, under certain climate conditions, extreme climate conditions. That's a really important take-home message. Why? Why is that important? It's important because it tells you something about the importance of climate change. Because if climate change is loading the dice to more frequent and extreme weather, and we know that prescribed burning has a constraint, it only works under more moderate conditions, then you're going into a future where this tactic is actually going to be rendered impotent. It's not going to work. So So then you're left with, well, we need to think about this. The second big con is that when you burn the fuel, you create smoke. So you're releasing the smoke, and often the best time to do prescribed burning is under moderate weather conditions on the shoulder season of a fire season, because you don't do it in the middle of summer because the next day could be dangerous. So you're doing it in the more moderate, predictable shoulder season, as we call it, often this time of year in autumn. So you're doing this burning, but the problem is that the best days to do the burning are the best days to be alive. Beautiful blue skies, very stable atmosphere, light winds. Guess what? The smoke starts ponding. And if you do it all around a place like Sydney or Hobart, you can end up ponding large quantities of smoke. Or if you do it in Western Australia, you can set the fires and the plumes waft over the plain, the Perth plain, and can fumigate a place like Perth. Recent analysis that we did in the Western Australian case, where we looked at the health impact, and we used a common currency, literally a dollar value, the health impacts of prescribed burning and wildfires in Western Australia over the last 15 years. And it turns out that under the current regime of planned burning, you're injuring as many people as is injured by wildfire. But that's under that regime, that's a fact. So maybe that's just the cost of reducing the wildfires. But maybe if you did more and more burning, you might not reduce the wildfires, but you might injure more people. So those trade-offs, as we call them, balance between the amount of burning you do and the benefit you get from the burning and the costs and the risks, that really is, in my opinion, a great big set of problems, a big box of problems that we have not adequately understood. So when people promote prescribed burning, it's almost like the way I talk about this, you say, like, there's no question prescribed burning works. It's fact, it's good. It is a good technique. But the analogy I like to use is, let's imagine I have a tool and it's called a hammer. And I build houses with my hammer. And I think my hammer's really awesome. I'm proud of my hammer and I love the houses I build. Now let's imagine that there's this other person, say you, and you build houses with a spanner. You don't use hammers. I don't need a hammer. I just use spanners. Now, you're proud of your house. So you've got two houses. So that's great. Now let's imagine that rather than respecting the fact that we've created two houses, we want to have a fight about spanners and hammers. My hammer is better than your spanner. Like, let's fight about that. Why? So there's no point, because you're forgetting the point. It's the outcome. You're wanting safe, sustainable landscapes by whatever means. If you can do it in another way, then why wouldn't you celebrate that? Why would you set up an argument as if it's all about this technique or you're a bad person? Why would you do that? Now, a sociologist might say, well, there are reasons why you would do that. You would do it because of institutional, you're wanting to, foster your institution, your culture. But what I would recommend for people who don't really care about, hammers or spanners or prescribed burning or mechanical thinning or using goats or green fire breaks or irrigation, of all of the other ways that you could manage fuel. If they just like, I just want a safe suburb. That's what I want. I don't really care how I do it. I just want it to be cost effective and safe. Then probably couldn't care less about, whether, this person thinks prescribed burning is really awesome and this person, doesn't. What we're really wanting to look at is the outcomes. And I think that the problem with the prescribed burning debate is absolutely true that it's an important tool but it does have consequences. There are side effects. And the smartest thing for land managers, landowners to do is to recognise those side effects. Be honest about it, because if you're not, the community's going to work it out anyway, and eventually you will lose the trust and the social licence for your preferred method. I mean, it may take some time, but eventually there will be some sort of social blowback. And, you know, that's not a fault of a community. You know, it's like we're in a democracy. People can have different points of view. They can challenge institutions and bureaucracies, and they should. We don't live in a dictatorship where, you know, the dictator or the institutions of the dictator, you know, will imprison you if you question, you know, policy or practice. You know, it's just healthy, normal, democratic behaviour to have a community, and it's actually a really healthy sign of a community to be interested in how of governance and how, you know, agencies or government departments or local councils or private individuals, how they're using the environment in a way, whether it's sustainable and whether it impacts other people. It's like really important to acknowledge that there are, you know, with prescribed burning, there's collateral consequences.
You touched on quite a few points in there, which sort of are referenced in my next two questions. So obviously, it's very complicated, and there are very many factors to consider. What do you think the fire management approaches how will they evolve going forward? And you also touched a bit upon traditional Aboriginal fire management techniques. Do you see a role for this? And then sort of, if you could tie in how local government can sort of best support this going forward, that would be great.
Well, actually, all of those 3 points are all I see as integral. I don't see them as even sub-branches. They're all integral. Let me explain. The renewal of Indigenous practices has been called cultural burning. And one of the features of cultural burning is a very strong place-based and a very strong attention to the effect of burning, not just to achieve an outcome of reducing fuel. So it's about place and it's about consequence. So I think that's a really valuable thing that Aboriginal people are sharing, that idea that you can use fire to tend the landscape and you get co-benefits. When I was talking about some collateral damage, but in their style, their emphasis is very aware of the co-benefits. And one of the differences, the big difference between prescribed burning and cultural burning is the scale and the tempo. It's smaller and it's slower. And therefore, it's more costly if you were trying to do it in an economically efficient way. It's not economically efficient. That's not what it is. It's not about economic efficiency. It's quite the opposite. It's about human landscape coupling. So where does that fit with local government and local community? Well, I see it as fitting absolutely lock and key, because what we can see here is the opportunity, rather than a top-down, this big agency which has got a big head office somewhere that's got all these, you know, command and control tentacles that, you know, are pushing out policy and strategy and so on, which is very, you know, the classical way of sort of centralised governance. What local council is so important about is that it actually is in our existing political system, an opportunity for the devolution of responsibility. It's very place-based, it's local, it's an avowed local, it's local. So you've got local place-based opportunities, you've got local councils that can start customizing solutions to the fire threat. And they can do that because they've got potentially fantastic access to the local community, because the local community, just in the same way as the Indigenous approach, the local community, the passion and the interest of local people to their place, to their suburb, to their favourite patch of bushland, to their amenity, to their reality, to ideally. And I think actually the pandemic may change this even more, because hopefully people will be doing less commuting. So local behaviours are likely to become turbocharged because more people hopefully are going to be able to spend more time working and recreating and less time commuting, because we've proven that you can actually work without commuting to a major office, which is marvellous, because, a mere 20 years ago, we didn't have those technologies. We've now got the technologies, or we've done a social experiment that we can work remotely. So I think if we, I understand that if you've got dormitory suburbs and people who are commuting from a dormitory suburb, they come home, they're exhausted, they've got families, probably their partner's working, they've got all of these stresses, the weekend rolls around, but, they haven't really got a lot of time to be thinking about fire management. But if we can have people have a bit more time and a bit more investment into their local community and be facilitated by local council, and the council providing incentives and advice, really important, because we know that really sustainable fire management, sustainability for surviving bushfire disasters actually starts in the back garden and works out. It's actually what's in your garden, your defensible space, your defensible suburb, and you're moving out in concentric rings. The current paradigm, putting all your eggs into a prescribed burning basket, is far, far away. Somebody is doing something to make me safe and I can just not engage. What we need to do is to get local communities to understand retrofitting their houses, to get them up to be, the BAL codes, understanding that the information the fire services are disseminating about defendable space, about non-flammable gardens, about having turning circles in suburbs where, fire trucks are moving around, all of that boring stuff seems to have, has got lost when it could be found. And if you, put that to the forefront and say the community and the individuals in the communities can be facilitated by local government. Wouldn't it be marvellous if local government said, well, we're going to provide a service to allow landowners to get an appraisal of their fire danger, or we can provide a rent rebate for people who get their house and their garden up to standard. Really incentivise, give them rewards, give them the tools, rather than the current model, which is, a whole lot of people in, disseminating information and saying, basically, it's your responsibility. Most people don't know what to do with their responsibility. Sure, they get a leaflet shoved in, their letterbox in the spring, or they get, some messaging, but, we're all busy, we're all being bombarded with information. How do you cut through that and get that information to go from, rather than just, background noise, and push that information into action, and to get that information to be up, rather than the performance indicatoring is that we disseminated a whole lot of information. We have no idea whether people acted on it. If the performance indicator was, we have seen in our suburb, in our local government area, we have seen a 20% increase in people properly following advice about being, bushfire ready. Something like that. We are able to facilitate people to do this work, and then to build, ultimately from this, we could end up with community groups that actually do their own fuel management, or organise, or at least negotiate with the council the types of fuel management they want. And these types of fuel management may be really quite novel. They may not be prescribed burning. They may be mechanical thinning and prescribed burning. They may be bringing in a herd of goats to eat down some weeds. They may be actually reimagining the weeds as being actually non-flammable plants like willows and celebrate it. Don't remove the willows. We like the willows because they're not flammable. We've got a grant. They may be, encouraging the council to divert the wastewater that was going to go down the drain or into the sea and put that back into a green fire break to create a halo around their town or their city. And you might think, well, that's a ridiculous idea. Well, actually, in Port Macquarie, when the swamp caught on fire, there wasn't enough water because of the drought to put the swamp out. And then somebody realised, we couldn't use seawater because that would kill the swamp. Somebody thought, well, we've got the wastewater. So they actually laid in real time a pipe to the swamp and put the fire out using wastewater. And then you think, well, we can do that with wastewater. Look at all the other fun things we could irrigate. I've been encouraging my university to put a irrigation line into a gully to turn a fire hazard into an amenity. Because in summer, it would actually be rather nice to go for a walk down a path and the sprinklers are just, turned on and it's all damp and cool and it's a hot evening and you could just go for a stroll down a nice, cool, beautiful, green, lush environment, outdoor air conditioning. Sure, you've got to use some water, but you're actually also converting a fire trap into a beautiful amenity.
Wow, that's amazing. So that suggestion of local councils sort of financially incentivizing homeowners and things like that to report back on their progress, is that happening at all anywhere to your knowledge?
Not that I know of. I am, a little bit in the interface of some of these things. I've been talking about, the insurance industry is in the same situation where, you have this perverse thing with the insurance premiums are going to go up because of climate change, but they haven't really developed good ways to reward good behaviour. So I'm not aware of it, and I would love to know about it, but there's a real opportunity to stop what I call problematizing, seeing everything as a problem. Guess what? We got a lifetime supply of problems. Actually what's interesting is to really talk about solutions and talking about adaptive management, but not just in an academic way of talking about adaptive management, talking about doing adaptive management projects. So I'm certain there's a cashed up council out there somewhere. Somebody wants to give it a red hot go and say, well, let's, we got a bit of money. We've got an opportunity because either we're going to, we can get people to come in and appraise the fire risk and we're going to lose houses here. So yeah, it might mean, they might think, well, we don't have any money, but then you have to think, well, you don't have any money. How are you going to get your community to bounce back from the impact of what's coming? And I quite like the phrase bounce forward. Maybe what we should be doing is saying, well, we're going to have to bounce. So we may as well bounce forward. We may as well do a bit of anticipatory work here. And if we could, incentivize good behavior or even, I appreciate times are going to be harder now because of the pandemic, but even really simple things like, you can see on brochures and in pictures what a fire safe house looks like and a fire safe garden. But how about having a real live one you can visit? Actually being able to say, look, this person has been kind enough. We know this is a brilliant setup they've got. Let's have an open day. Let's get people to go and to look at what, and get inspired. Having things for busy people like contractors who can do the work, like where do you start? How do you fireproof your house? To do the ember guards and all of that work. Maybe there are people who want to do that and are willing to spend their own money, but they don't even know where to begin. So, and of course, if you start those practices of getting assessments, and maybe the council could subsidise assessments, maybe the council could, you could imagine councils with, loaning an iPad where you go and you use the iPad and you do your own assessment. There's all, we've proven with the pandemic that when humans really want to change, they change. So why don't we, do a little bit of bouncing forward, a little bit of adaptive management, a little bit of play, not necessarily, doing the idea that we've got the universal solution, but rather than just saying, well, why don't we, try this in this community or this suburb, or hands up who wants to try this. And then through that, you could actually start building, snowballing the process, basically. That's what we need. At the moment, we're all just sitting there going, this is too hard. Let's have an argument about hammers and spanners. Let's blame somebody, rather than saying, well, really the solution is in the community, in the backyard. It's at the very local scale. In the end, obviously, we've got to decarbonise and stabilise the climate. But once people get on the program and form community groups, you may have people who couldn't give a stuff about climate change. But once they start interacting with each other and respecting different points of view, I'm absolutely certain that as a group, its attitudes would evolve and become more respectful. There would be deeper understanding between people who are pro-burning and anti-burning and climate change deniers and people who are terrified out of their wits about, what's coming and all the rest of it. They do know that the solution to a lot of this anxiety, which does drive a lot of this disagreement because people are anxious and stressed, a lot of the solution is actually action. If you give people action, then they can actually de-stress, because they at least can go to sleep at night going, well, I'm making progress. I'm getting there. I'm seeing that something is being done, rather than I know that my suburb or my little town could be incinerated next summer, like that looming, stress. Or for the poor unfortunate people who've been impacted by the fires, there's absolutely no reason why they won't be re-impacted by the fires. And a lot of people who've been impacted by bushfires are very, very sensitive to even the slightest smell of smoke can cause them to be, very anxious because of what they've been through, such a terrible experience. So I'm really optimistic that the community and I see the local government, frankly, as the sleeping giants of the global fire crisis.